One of the biggest mistakes that we make in fantasy football is we take situation and vacated volume and we apply that to players' value and we overdraft them because we think that just because there's a lot of opportunity in an offense, that means that a player is going to produce. And that's not necessarily true. In fact, it's one of the biggest things that bites fantasy football players year after year. It's also one of the things that we can like lean on and know we're going to be right about something because it happens year over year. I mean, you can call your shots on anything in fantasy football and be right about some and wrong about some, and that's just how it is. But the vacated volume fallacy, as we like to call it, is one that we lean on every year for some good analysis. And this is how we kind of got a ton of crap last year, telling people not to draft Tony Pollard. And part of the reason that we weren't necessarily sold on Tony Pollard last year was because one of the main reasons that he was being drafted as high as he was because the opportunity went up. In terms of the situation, the situation for Tony Pollard was probably the same. The offense was mostly the same. They did get a new offensive coordinator, so nobody was really taking that into account. But again, had Ezekiel Elliott still been there, or had they brought in somebody to kind of take away the carries that people thought Tony Pollard would get and be productive on in the first place, Tony Pollard probably wouldn't have been drafted at the 1-2 turn in fantasy drafts last year. But because you saw Tony Pollard be effective and efficient in a running back 2 role in the year before, essentially what people did is they applied that to the upcoming year and said, okay, because he's going to be getting more volume, then he's going to be this productive times even more because now you have more opportunity. And that is not It's simply not true, and we've seen case after case of this. Another good example of this last year was Alexander Mattison. Dalvin Cook wasn't overly productive in the Vikings offense to begin with when you saw him before he went to the Jets and did absolutely nothing. But people applied the volume in that offense to Alexander Mattison and basically said, okay, Alexander Mattison, we're going to draft him as a starting running back prices because he's going to get the volume there. He's going to be the lead back. He's going to win the starting job, and that's enough. And a lot of times we look at these running backs and say, yeah, it's a warm body getting carries, and that's enough. But when you're talking about fantasy football, especially in PPR leagues, it's not enough. It's not. No. A lot of times, the running backs that we're targeting in fantasy football leagues are the ones that have receiving upside or high floors or things like that. Some other good examples of this, though, as we kind of demonstrate how this has played out.
Some of these are fun.
Devontae Adams and Allen Lazard. Remember that one?
Yes.
And everybody was overdrafting Allen Lazard because, again,
especially in fantasy,
he was Aaron Rodgers' wide receiver 1.
Right.
And Devontae Adams is a guy that had 30+% target share. Allen Lazard did not have that. Again, you think, oh, the target share has to go somewhere. That's the biggest argument. People, we saw a tweet breaking down the Broncos. What did that tweet say? Like, that was the one about like the target share and how much available target share there was for Troy Franklin.
I don't know. It basically said that Troy Franklin's going to be amazing
because of the target share that was available. But do keep in mind when you're talking about target share that a lot of these teams have really high percentages of target share that go to non-fantasy relevant players. A good example of this was New England last year. New England had like 53% of their targets go to players that were not fantasy productive. Right? You saw this on even some worse offenses as well. The New York Giants, 43% of their targets went to players that were non-fantasy relevant. So really, like, part of it is the only way that you're going to get somebody in there that's going to command enough targets is if you get an elite playmaker in there. Because again, targets are player dependent.
Yes, it's less about the opportunity and more about the player. Why would I bet the farm on Josh Palmer getting a ton of opportunity when Mike Williams goes down 2-3 years ago? And same, honestly, for this year, too. Like, some people do expect Josh Palmer to be pretty productive in this new Jim Harbaugh offense because Mike Williams and Keenan Allen are both gone. I would rather put my money on other assets in that offense than Josh Palmer. And look, I mean, the same thing applies to like a Khalil Herbert. Multiple years in a row in Chicago, right, where everyone was expecting Khalil Herbert to be the guy. Even last year, even though his price wasn't like out of this world ridiculous, because there was a question like, was it going to be Freeman? Was it going to be Herbert? Was it going to be Roshan Johnson? A lot of people in the fantasy community were really, really dead set on Khalil Herbert, again, because he had the experience in that offense. But again, with that experience in that offense, what did he ever do? Nothing notable outside of like a 2-game sample size of nice production, because he's just not that guy. Like when David Montgomery left, what did we expect Khalil Herbert to do? Way too much.
And again,
way too much.
Mathematically, the mistake that people make with this is we take efficiency as a backup and we scale it to starting running back workload, and it just doesn't happen like that, because everybody said, oh, Khalil Herbert, when he was, in 2022, he averaged 5.7 yards per carry. And yes, in 2023, 4.6 yards per carry is still good. But you saw that go down a whole yard because he did get more volume. He had more receptions. He had more rushing attempts by a couple. But what happened to Khalil Herbert's production when he moved from backup to starter? 9.1 fantasy points per game in 2022, 37th. 9.4 in 2023, 37th. It was identical. Yeah. That is how, I mean, let's even look at Tony Pollard. Tony Pollard had a good year last year. It just depended on what your expectations were for him. But you actually saw him lose 2.5 fantasy points per game, going to a bigger workload, getting 60 more rushing attempts.
When everyone thought he was going to get more touchdowns, he got less opportunity in the red zone.
Because he had the same amount of rushing yards on 60 more rush attempts. He averaged 1.2 yards per carry less. He had more receptions, but had less yards. And had 6 less touchdowns. And so what was the actual kicker there for his production? What actually made the difference? Was it the volume? Why was he less productive?
The touchdowns and, I mean, the increased rushing attempts.
Yeah, the decrease in efficiency, and, right. but the decrease in touchdowns. You lost 36 fantasy points there.
Yep.
And again, touchdowns are volatile.
Yep.
So if you have a player that's scoring touchdowns at a high rate and you're applying it because it's like, oh, their efficiency, well, it doesn't always work like that.
Yeah. If you guys remember it feels like way back in the day. It really wasn't that long ago. But remember the Chase Edmonds hype, especially in fantasy. Everyone, including myself, I still remember I was like, Chase Edmonds, like he is the guy this year. Kenyon Drake is gone because if you remember, Kenyon Drake had some really, really good years in both Miami and Arizona. Arizona, he wasn't like a bell cow running back, right? He was splitting time with Chase Edmonds and he was getting all the red zone opportunity. He left and everyone applied all of Kenyon Drake's volume to Chase Edmonds. And everyone thought that he had like high-end running back 2, low-end running back 1 upside. And what happened? Chase Edmonds, he couldn't handle it.
No.
His efficiency went way down despite his receiving upside. So J.K. Dobbins is a big example of this. When J.K. Dobbins went down, which was, when does he not go down? Gus Edwards and Justice Hill last year. Gus Edwards is being treated right now like he was some 2023 success story when he ended up being like a low-end running back 2 in last year's running back market. That's not that impressive with like a majority of the volume. It was Gus Edwards or Justice Hill. Gus Edwards or Justice Hill. Which one is it going to be? It ended up being Gus Edwards. And what did he do? He didn't win you a league. He definitely did not win you a league. So the whole point of telling you about all of these examples over the last few years where the vacated volume fallacy has applied, we want to apply that to situations this year. What are some players that are being drafted way higher than we think they should because of the vacated volume fallacy? And really, you should be avoiding them. Let's start with the clearest one in our opinion.
And the biggest one here is going to be Josh Jacobs transitioning out and going to Zamir White as the lead back in Las Vegas. And a lot of people are saying, in Dynasty even, you're too low on Zamir White. But I'm sure we're going to get it here. You're too low on Zamir White. Zamir White's a bell cow. Zamir White's going to be really good.
We could be.
So here's the thing with the other situations that we just mentioned. When you're talking about Tony Pollard, when you're talking about Khalil Herbert, they were really efficient as backups. And so that's the biggest appeal.
Jerome Ford last year.
Jerome Ford's a great one.
Yeah.
That's the biggest appeal to where it was like when we were putting them in the starting role, it's like, okay, they're really good, clearly. So they're good running backs going to a starting role. Zamir White, the difference there is he's a bad running back going to a bigger role. Because Zamir White, I mean, as a backup was not that good. You saw the yards per carries in the 5s for backup running backs, 4.1 and 4.3 over his first couple years, which isn't bad. Again, in the 3s is bad, but in the 4s is average at best. And when you're talking about fantasy points, he had 104 rushing attempts last year and 4.4 fantasy points per game. Let's talk about that level of efficiency. I mean, last year, obviously, yes, opportunity share was 56th in the entire NFL among running backs. But when you're looking at his efficiency, 28th in true yards per carry, 32nd in yards per touch, 16th in breakaway run rate, 52nd in yards created, 30th in yards created per touch, 52nd in production premium. This is not an efficient running back. And Zamir White, I don't think this should be surprising. If you followed Zamir White out of Georgia, Zamir White was never really a good prospect. In fact, Zamir White was the lead back at Georgia, and he got drafted behind James Cook, who was not the lead back there, but had a better NFL skill set, and you've seen them completely flip-flop. James Cook has had success in the NFL, and we were wrong about that. Like, he has been fantasy relevant, and he still is. But with Zamir White, you're talking about an inefficient backup running back moving to a starting role where last year Josh Jacobs was extremely inefficient.
Extremely.
And the situation
is
no different.
Didn't get any better.
It would be different if they had bolstered their offensive line or gotten a quarterback to where you have to kind of be worried about that. They drafted a tight end.
Right. And when you play fantasy football, you're playing for the end of the season. If I were to put money on Zamir White being productive, it would be in the first half of the season, because that's what running backs in this situation do.
Yeah.
They taper off at the end of the season because they get tired. The physical abuse of football is like, it's legit, man. It's absolutely legit. And we just haven't seen it from Zamir White to string together 17 straight games of consistent production. Last year alone, like, was he really that incredible? Like, according to Player Profiler, his game log in a four game sample size, 17.5 points, 14.5, 15, and 13. Like, that's not like league winning upside, really. It was just kind of, he was at the right place at the right time because Josh Jacobs went down for a 4-game sample size.
But it's also part of that is he was a backup running back, and then at the end of the year where they had absolutely nothing to lose and absolutely nothing to play for, he steps in.
Yes.
And this is why he's being drafted where he is, because he was performing as a running back too. He's being drafted as a running back too. If he performs at this level, I don't think that's that bad a price, honestly. Like, if he does, because again, if I had to bet on a reason that Zamir White ended up being productive in fantasy this year, I would say that it was because he scored a lot of touchdowns. Mm-hmm. I don't think this is a guy with absurd receiving upside or anything. I mean, looking at his targets, he only went over 5 targets once the entire season. And so is there an avenue for Zamir White to be productive? Yes.
Absolutely, because he's the running back one there. But again, we play this game every single year with these types of running backs, and that's kind of the point. And when you're looking at Zamir White's price right now, according to ESPN ADP, there are a bunch of wide receivers around this range that I'd rather have. George Pickens, much rather have. And I'm not even a big Pickens guy. Amari Cooper, are you kidding me? He just had a 20% target share last year. Chris Godwin, 22% target share last year. Tony Pollard. Guys, Tony Pollard is the guy that just had over 1,000 yards from scrimmage last year. Even though it was disappointing, he's now going into a situation where he will be splitting carries, and less is more with Pollard. That is historically proven. Terry McLaurin, wide receiver one in his offense. Kyler Murray, rushing upside.
Man.
Kyle Pitts literally
All
has
of those
top
guys.
3 tight end upside. I'd take all of those guys easily.
All right, next on this list, Stephon Diggs leaving Buffalo and going to Keon Coleman. I think a lot of people, look, and we're not going to do this with every rookie.
No, in fairness, there's an avenue for Keon Coleman to be productive in Buffalo. We literally just did a video about rookies that could be productive this year, and Keon Coleman is one of those guys.
But a lot of people, you're talking about moving from Stephon Diggs, who was one of the best 5 wide receivers in the NFL for the past 4 years, to Keon Coleman, who not only is a rookie prospect, he is a very raw rookie prospect. And so he's very underdeveloped so far. I think he's going to have to develop a lot more to see some serious fantasy upside, because again, I don't think Josh Allen is going to be able to target Keon Coleman at a super high rate, and Stephon Diggs was top 5 in targets last year. It's a massive difference. Really, the player you should be looking at that from a vacated volume standpoint is Dalton Kincaid.
Yeah.
With Keon Coleman, obviously, again, you could make this argument for every single rookie that went to a situation like that. You can make it for Ladd McConkey. You can make it for Brian Thomas Jr. Totally understandable. And yes, again, Keon Coleman, he could break out. He could end up having an amazing season, and we could end up just being like, crap, we missed on that one.
Yeah, but we'll talk about this again and again and again. I think a lot of people are overlooking the offensive coordinator change in the middle of the season for Buffalo last year, and how that really changed their offensive scheme. And I think that's going to mean less of one wide receiver getting 27% of the targets in that offense like Stephon Diggs. It's just not going to happen again. That's not the type of offense that they're going to run in 2024. And when you're looking at the guys, again, going around them, even I'll touch on the rookies like Odunze and Ladd McConkey. I'd rather take shots, I think, on both of those guys. I think maybe Rome Odunze is debatable because he could be the 3rd option this year as a rookie in Chicago. But I don't know, as a talent, like he went top 10 in the first round, and they took him for a reason to be the guy long-term with Caleb Williams. Maybe he can be productive this year. Jackson Smith and Jigba. Hollywood Brown. Rasheed Rice is probably going to be suspended. Hollywood Brown got a nice 1-year deal with Kansas City, and he got good target share in a bad offense last year. You translate that to a good offense in Kansas City, he'll probably be pretty productive this year as well. Jaden Reed, that's a wide receiver one with Jordan Love in Green Bay, debatably. But still, like, I'd take a shot on him as well.
Yeah.
So the next guy we're going to have here with this vacated volume fallacy is Chase Brown. I think this is funny that we're applying the vacated volume fallacy to the wrong running back in the offense. Like, if you're going to take a shot on anyone in Cincinnati at the running back position, why not invest in the guy who has shown that he can be productive in solid stretches, like in Indianapolis and Zach Moss, and the team actually has monetary investment in? Like, monetary investment cannot be overlooked in fantasy football. I understand that there's risk with any running back in that offense, and I understand that Chase Brown has some receiving upside, but there is more investment as a franchise with the Cincinnati Bengals in Zach Moss than there is Chase Brown. They paid him to go there, and they paid him a significant amount of money for a running back that isn't really that big of a name.
No.
But look, if you're to apply the vacated volume fallacy to anyone, apply it to the guy who's already demonstrated that he can do it. Jonathan Taylor last year was injured for a majority of the season. Zach Moss came in, and you literally, as Colts fans, we almost didn't even have to blink.
No, it was crazy.
It was wild.
Insane.
And I didn't expect it at all. We were telling people left and right to sell Zach Moss because we kept expecting him to fall off. And he never did. He never did. And granted, Zach Moss has historically struggled with injury and durability. I get it. But why not take the shot on the one who's proven that he can be productive than the one who hasn't? That's really, really the biggest point here. I would not say that Chase Brown is going to be the next Joe Mixon from a volume perspective there in 2024.
All right, let's go to Tony Pollard and leaving that backfield for Rico Dowdle, Deuce Vaughn, Ezekiel Elliott. Here's the strategy I'm taking into drafting running backs from this team this year. I'm not drafting running backs from this team.
No.
I'm not
pass. No thanks.
Price out the window.
Maybe Zeke if he's super duper cheap.
If he's super cheap.
Because Zeke, in fairness, last year was impressively productive on a horrible offense.
And because with Zeke, they saw their current running back room and they brought him in.
And they brought him in.
So
right.
Obviously they wouldn't have done that if they didn't think there was an avenue for him to be productive.
Exactly.
But again, like, I don't think you see a Cowboys running back going super high. Rico Dowdle is going far too high in my opinion, but not high enough to where it matters. And so I would just avoid this offense in terms of running backs altogether, not avoid the offense. Definitely draft CeeDee Lamb, please.
And some more smaller guys here, like Ty Chandler filling in the Alexander Madison role in Minnesota. Don't forget that Aaron Jones is there, and I know Aaron Jones is being drafted accordingly, like he will be the lead running back there. But there is technically an avenue, the way the Minnesota Vikings run their backfield, there is an avenue for Ty Chandler to be productive, and neither of us are really buying it. Honestly, we're just not. Like, it took a lot for Madison to be productive there in limited sample sizes, and I'm just not buying it with Chandler, who's never really consistently demonstrated it in the past. Yeah. Now, he showed it again in flashes last year, like the Cincinnati Bengals game where he was very productive. But again, that's just not something that I see being a guy that I want to take a shot on who's already the running back 2 in his offense.
Yeah. And then last year, again, some smaller ones, but like Austin Eckler, like the Chargers backfield, Gus Edwards, J.K. Dobbins, Kamani Vidal. Kamani Vidal is the best value of those guys because you're getting him cheaper than the other two, and we think he has the best skill set of those guys. Gus Edwards was productive last year, but he was productive mainly because he got a ton of touchdowns, right? I think he had 12 touchdowns or something last year.
Yeah.
I'll fact check
myself.
He
had 13 touchdowns. With 13 touchdowns, he was 32nd among running backs in fantasy points per game.
And a running back year where really it was a down year in terms of scoring across the board. And so I think, with Gus Edwards, with J.K. Dobbins, the one thing we learned from them when they both played in Baltimore is you can't really trust them in your flex spot to score at a high level. And 11 points per game is good. So it's not like you're not drafting him, but in that price range that Gus Edwards is going, there's a lot better options. Where's Gus Edwards going in ESPN drafts? And then maybe some guys to pivot off of and draft instead of Gus Edwards.
Yeah, so Gus Edwards is going around some of these other running backs like Javonte Williams, again, has questions of his own. Devin Singletary, questions of his own. Zach Moss, we already talked about Zach Moss. We'd rather take the shot on Zach Moss, but every single one of those running backs that I just listed, I'd rather have than Gus Edwards. Heck, even Zeke Elliott, who, again, we just talked about, I'd rather take the shot on Zeke Elliott, who we know is probably going to get all the opportunities in the red zone. And Gus Edwards, again, we just don't really know because there's so many other running backs in that offense that are unproven and haven't done anything, one of which is Kamani Vidal. Like, just take a shot on another guy or even a wide receiver in that range.
Yeah, and again, there's no guarantee that these guys will produce. There's also no guarantee that they won't produce. So there are obviously there are avenues for these guys to be productive in fantasy football, or we wouldn't be talking about them. So it wouldn't be some super shocker if they came out and Zamir White was a running back too. That would not surprise me. He's a starting running back. And so being a starting running back and getting volume matters for something. just be careful not to overdraft these guys is my point. And don't target them solely based on their opportunity, I think is kind of what we want you to walk away with. So if you haven't already, make sure you drop a like on this channel and make sure you subscribe as well if you play fantasy football. It really helps us out. It's 2 things that really help us out. Free, easy to take you 5 seconds. Appreciate you guys. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you later.